exciting conversation. As a national security reporter, I feel like this week is like my Super Bowl, so I'm really excited about this. And as you heard, we've got a great panel and a short amount of time, so I won't waste much time. We'll dive right in. Tara, I'd like to start with you. We've obviously got these U.S. elections looming in the background, news about these French elections that might be a bit surprising, but Jens Stoltenberg earlier today said he won't touch domestic politics. That's part of the strength of NATO. They don't comment on domestic politics and how it affects NATO. I'd like you to do just that. Ignore Jens' advice here and talk about this nexus between domestic politics, particularly in Europe, and NATO, because there's all these headwinds of far left, far right that seem to be questioning the vitality and the strength of the alliance. What do you see going forward amid all these elections?
Thanks, Robbie, and thanks for having me today. I think you're really right. It's really hard to distinguish between domestic and foreign politics right now, and I, for one, think it's a good thing. I kind of laud the fact that people are more and more interested in foreign policy and want to have their views reflected in their votes, and we've been seeing that. In the US, we're seeing it right now, but of course in Europe too, where we've seen a number of politicians on the far right, the far left, but also in the center, making NATO, commitment to European security, transatlantic relations, a key message of their platforms, some for, some against, some thinking about trying to do things differently, try to bring NATO into the 21st century as well. And so we've seen views around NATO polarize a lot. And as I said, I think that's quite positive in the end. It's been complicated for the alliance to navigate that because one of the key objectives of the alliance is to have political cohesion. We've seen struggles in that political cohesion for a long time now with a number of allies. And talking about these issues and these problems very openly, I think in the mid to long run is going to help the alliance.
And Kyron, you've worked in the Trump administration. We've got the US elections coming up in November. I think the big question on everyone's minds right now in Brussels, other European capitals, is what would a second Trump term policy look like for Europe, for Ukraine, for NATO? Can you give us some insight on that and where you see the Republicans stand on Ukraine, on NATO overall?
Well, if I could really answer that question, I'd probably get a Nobel Prize. So whatever I say, I'm going on base. I'm looking at the past, and I think the first Trump term is instructive for what will happen next. But I like your overall question about the connection between domestic politics and international relations. I think NATO, for some reason, has become the center of that particular intersection. And it starts in 2016. I was a voter in Pennsylvania for almost 22 years and was in that state at the time. And everyone in the foreign policy world said, Trump is nuts to campaign on an issue of burden sharing and fingering NATO. But then the experts looked at the numbers, which we hadn't really thought about for a long time. I think we had with NATO a difficult time moving into the 21st century because the Bush administration really got mugged by history with 9/11 and focused more on the global war on terror. But when we looked at some of what Trump was saying in terms of being more analytical about it and empirical, at that point, I think there were, 29 members of NATO and 4 or 5 countries, US, UK, Poland, Estonia, and Greece, were meeting the 2% pledge. And I said somewhat facetiously at the time, if you're relying on Greece for Western defense, you're in real trouble. But, other nations were paying quite a bit. But by the time Trump left office, that number had doubled, and hundreds of billions of dollars for mutual defense were going into the NATO coffers. I know some say it's multifactorial, that it was also due to the Obama administration and some things that it did. But NATO wasn't weaker on some hard metrics by the end of the Trump administration. And the US hadn't pulled out. Trump is Trump, and he says what he says. But if you look at what we were doing as Trump political appointees, I don't know one person that was, wringing his or her hands thinking, how do we get out of this alliance? But how do we make it stronger? And I don't even think this is about Trump. If you look at the vast middle of the country where there aren't coastal elites, there's not the Beltway, many people have fundamental questions about Why are we in the wars we've been in? What does NATO do? Does Article 5 mean we can be in war at any particular time? These are really big, healthy questions to ask in the world's most durable alliance. So this idea that a new Trump administration will mean massive isolationism in the U.S., I just don't see the evidence of it. Both sides have wings of their parties and movements that are isolationist or non-interventionist. But that's probably healthy, and it's fundamentally a big American debate. It was in the 1930s, and it was even before then. So I think, it'll be a stronger alliance. I don't see us exiting it, but it may look different. And at 75 years old, you're different than you were when you were 50.
Just to push for a sec, as the last panel before us said, both sides have a fringe here, but one side, that fringe or the perceived fringe is running for president. And he's talked about, not defending allies who don't meet the 2% threshold. Yeah. Don't you think there's a marked difference on the Republican side? And I guess, how do you allay concerns when you're talking to Europeans about a second Trump term, if there is fears, credible or not, of abandoning NATO or abandoning Ukraine?
Yeah, I just disagree with your premise that one person running is the fringe of the fringe in his own party. I think he's asking big questions aloud. I've always said that I think it's the job of the advisors to turn Trump's hunches and instincts into hypotheses. They often didn't do it because they didn't take him seriously enough. But I think asking big questions aloud in the middle of a presidential race shows some bravery, and it's a good idea. And I just, maybe I'm not following it closely, but I just don't see where there is a full stop commitment to pulling out of NATO by Donald Trump day one if countries don't meet a particular pledge. But, the Europeans can do more. We've expanded NATO with some high-tech countries that have great economies and give us a lot more immediate coverage in terms of being closer to Russia. Some of this discussion, I think, shouldn't even be taking place. The alliance has to evolve. The world has changed. There are new threats, and the U.S. has huge responsibilities. The U.S. wants to remain, for the most part, many people, a predominant power on earth. If it's going to do that, it has to have a strong economy, and there are some guns versus butter trade-offs that have to be made. That's better for Europe in the long run. A stronger U.S., determined by the American people, however we do it, makes the world a lot safer. And it's just, my belief that when the U.S. is strong and matches its values and its interests to its strength, everyone is better off, and in particular, Europe.
Sam, one of the reasons the nexus of this domestic and foreign policy debate is so existential is obviously because of the war in Ukraine, biggest land war in Europe since World War II. It seems to have ground to a stalemate. There's all these debates going on this week at the NATO summit against the backdrop of these elections. Can you give us an update on where things stand in the war right now? And if you see either side having an edge that could turn into a breakthrough at this point, or is it just going to continue being a stalemate muddling along in the coming future?
Well, I think it's challenging to characterize it as a stalemate in part because there's movement on the line of contact and there's a lot of dynamism on the battlefield, so to speak. But it is true overall that Russia has been making gains in the last 6 months, I would say largely of a tactical nature and at tremendous cost, but gains nonetheless, both in the northeast and now in the Donetsk region. But there really hasn't been a strategic shift on the battlefield since the Ukrainians' November 2022 counteroffensive in the Kherson region. And that was almost 2 years ago. This is clearly a war that favors the defense on the ground. But arguably, the line of contact and the sort of territorial control question is now a distraction from what is perhaps more important for both sides, that is this campaign of deep strikes that both are undertaking into the both critical infrastructure and military targets far deeper through behind the front lines. And, on that score, clearly Russia is imposing costs at a much higher level than the Ukrainians are, even though, of course, their capacity to do so has been underestimated. So I think, there does not seem to be a clear path to breaking this overall dynamic, but the costs that both sides are undertaking or taking on are quite significant, and particularly the Ukrainians, who, of course, are suffering disproportionately.
Tara, talking about the cost, this war dragging out, no strategic shift. There seems to be a fear among Ukraine supporters that eventually the publics in the West will grow tired of supporting Ukraine, of giving over cash, of giving over weapons, this war dragging out, no foreseeable end. Do you see that happening? Is that manifesting itself either in elections, in concerns among policymakers? I guess how much longer can the West support Ukraine before our publics grow tired of putting this treasure into this war?
So, we started talking about war fatigue, I think 2 weeks into the beginning of the war in Ukraine. And
is there talk about war fatigue now?
I guess amongst think tankers and maybe journalists as well. But I do think it's something to be worried about. I would also deconstruct it a little bit. My sense is, and looking at polls, is that actually politicians are more worried about war fatigue than European populations themselves. They've been supporting the support to Ukraine quite consistently now, and a lot of the politicians who try to make the support to Ukraine a polarizing issue and a key issue in elections have not systematically won, and they've even lost in a number of European elections right now. So I do think we need to be careful about that rhetoric, and policymaking is about making choices. I think this is also what we'll see this week in Washington. What choice does NATO make in terms of building its future relationship with Ukraine? It has to say something quite clear about it. Whether it's the bridge or not the bridge or something, an invitation, not an invitation, I think there needs to be clarity and transparency that comes from the alliance and its leaders, because this is also how we win the domestic political fight. You need to be clear in terms of what you say to your voters. I think it's fine to make choices, but they need to be clear and stated. And I just wanted to say something about what the professor said about posing big questions, big policy questions. What Trump did in February was not pose a question when he said that he would encourage Vladimir Putin to invade whatever country didn't meet the 2% challenge. He was positing a policy option that Vladimir Putin, who is allegedly one of America and Europe's big rivals, heard. This is not just about having a policy discussion. If you're aiming to rule and lead the world's most powerful country, what you're saying has a meaning. It carries a lot of sense. And I think what he says is also about building the credibility of the alliance. This is also something that we'll test today. How credible is NATO in the 21st century? When one of the main candidates to the US presidential election, a key stakeholder in NATO, says that he doesn't really believe in it. Whatever he does, he's in a way already weakened the alliance. And I think it's really important for American people and European people to hear that, because this is not just a policy expert discussion. It's a real world policy maker discussion. And I just wanted to say this for a second.
Yeah, and Kyron, I want to give you a chance to respond to that. But I also wanted to throw in my own question here, which is, you talked about when NATO burden sharing briefly. At one point, only 3 or 4 members were meeting the 2% threshold. Mm-hmm. Now we're up to 23 at the end of this year, as NATO official estimates go. Is Europe doing enough to rebuild, to rearm, to satisfy the wing of the Republican Party that Trump represents, that says the U.S. has taken on too much burden sharing for too long? It's time for Europe to step up.
So let me try to answer both questions, and I'll start with yours. I don't think it's just a dollar amount, and the Wells Pledge was a pledge, but it was about something deeper. And so when I'm saying, and this connects to your question, Trump is making big statements, asking big questions, making major assertions. It is actually important for the future of the alliance to do this. And there has to be some shock value, because it's not, some nations should put more than 2% in. If you aren't even meeting the 2% pledge, and this is what Trump hasn't said, and this is what I'm saying, there's some deeper problems in mutual defense and security. That means you're probably not doing all that you should do with R&D. That means that You aren't doing getting ready for new and exotic technologies. You're just weaker overall. So I think it's more of a bellwether for something more significant that he hasn't talked about. It also says something about the U.S. Commitments and its own economy, because everyone knows the U.S. is kind of a mess on getting a budget. We often live on CRs, but some of our allies are pretty good at getting a budget, projecting 5 years out. If they're relying on us for a large part of their mutual defense, there is a case to be made that there's a double tax for the American public, because then we're helping to defray the cost of their own social welfare policy when ours is a disaster. This is a big discussion among many Americans, and it's not the fringe of the Republican Party. And I don't think that the candidate on the Republican side is on the fringe on this particular issue. At 75 years old, we should have real discussions about the nature and purpose of the alliance. We've got new members, new threats. No one ever thought NATO would expand quite the way that it has. The high north countries weren't even in the conversation just a couple of years ago. What does all of this mean? And, what does burden sharing look like in a very different world? It's not 1945 to 1970. For most of that time, the U.S. was the undisputed power on every metric in the world. We don't control the global share of GDP the way that we once did. Having this discussion is really critical. You made the statement about Trump and what he has said about Putin versus NATO and the Ukraine conflict. Perhaps he's really trying to kind of shock our alliance and the West into a bigger reality. And this is an important question. Why is it that the U.S. is paying so much of the Ukraine war on the defense side? The Europeans come back and say we're doing a lot of the humanitarian aid and so on. But why? Why the U.S.? Why is Zelensky showing up, lecturing us, going to Congress, telling us what we should do? And when we have a lot of fundamental problems ourselves, you can't help anyone if you can't survive yourself. The first law of nature is self-preservation. So I just see this in a bigger context. I'm pro-alliance, I'm pro-Europe. I worked on NATO more than anything else. When I was at the State Department, that wasn't particularly easy. But if you can't have hard questions and you can't have a candidate talking the way he wants to in a free society, there's a problem. That's another problem that we need to be concerned about.
One of the big issues right now that we're seeing at the summit is, of course, the question of Ukraine membership. I want to dive into that because there's this big debate about Ukraine maybe eventually getting NATO membership. Tara mentioned this. The administration has this plan for a bridge to membership that some see as an actual bridge, others see as a consolation prize. But at some point, taking a step back, this war is going to end as all wars end. And there's going to have to be a serious debate about what does this mean for Ukraine? What does this mean for the West's relationship with Russia? It's a very simple, easy question. Sam, I'd love for you to quickly tackle that for us before we dive more into the summit stuff.
Well, I think, there's actually a fair amount of discussion about the context of the war ending for Ukraine's future security, and a lot of discussion about the potential for alliance membership in that context. But one thing that I think is perhaps not getting as much discussion as it should is the question of how the alliance is going to deal with Russia in the long term after the hot phase of this war is over. We're not likely to be facing good choices in that context. They're likely to be choices between sort of bad and worse. There's no going back to the pre-2022 status quo ante, which, by the way, wasn't so great to begin with. So, the confrontation will not end when the hot war in Ukraine is over. And that this will just be a different phase of a broader confrontation that the alliance will be facing with an aggrieved, militarized, and isolated Russia. And so I think you can think about that post-war period in terms of relations with Russia and what that will look like along two potential scenarios. One you might think of as the early Cold War, the 1950s, when there was largely an unstable period in the competition in the core, that is in Europe, with the multiple crises over Berlin and multiple kinetic incidents along the Soviet Union's periphery involving U.S. reconnaissance aircraft where, servicemen actually died in quite large numbers, surprisingly. But the rules were unclear, and the lines were not solidified. I think, frankly, that is likely to be the most probable scenario that we're facing. A less likely, but arguably, from my perspective at least, preferable one would be this sort of détente-era Cold War. This, of course, was still a Cold War, and there were bitter disagreements, but there were a series of agreements and understandings about the rules of the road, essentially, the guardrails of the competition, everything from bilateral U.S.-Soviet arms control to agreements on the German question and the Helsinki Final Act. So that created a degree of stability in the core of the Cold War competition. Obviously, on the periphery in places like Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Africa, there was anything but stability. But in the core, in Europe, there was at that stage, at least by comparison to what was happening in the 50s. So which of these two outcomes we get obviously depends a lot on Russia's intentions and objectives in the post-war context, but it also depends on NATO's policy and whether the alliance and individual allies are willing to engage to establish the kind of norms that existed in that later Cold War period.
Yeah, and I mean, I wanted to pose the same question almost to both of you because it's so important. I mean, and a lot of this gets at Ukraine's membership, the question of Ukraine's NATO membership, which in Putin's eyes is a driving factor for this war. So, I mean, real quick, what do you make of the debate on NATO bringing Ukraine in as a member? Do you think that's a good idea? Do you think that could provoke the other side, even if it doesn't, which is likely not to happen, doesn't happen at this summit?
You wanna? I was hoping I wouldn't have to answer that one. But,
the job of journalists is to ask questions that are annoying.
I have a cold, but no, I think it's, this one's really hard. I think for what would be the emerging administration. I have heard presidential candidate Donald Trump say he wants a negotiated solution to Ukraine super fast. How likely that is, it's hard to say, but expanding NATO, eastward, I think is going to be a big challenge in terms of policy debates right away in the administration. And even in the Biden administration, there's a careful look at this matter. It's not, let's just do it. I don't think it's it's kind of a false binary opposite. Either we go in and support Ukraine or not. I think on both sides, there's some huge questions about what this means. And so I don't really I'm not sure what your question is. Are you trying to ask me what do I think a Trump administration will do?
Yeah.
I think it'll be round-tabled and round-tabled and round-tabled for quite some time. And there will be some huge commitments, it's my sense, I can't speak for Donald Trump, from Ukraine and from NATO partners if this is to happen. But I don't think it's just to look at the U.S. in terms of Ukraine joining. When we expanded to the High North, you had Hungary and Turkey, slow walking it, making some commitments or asking that certain commitments happen. I think there will be other members too that want to know what this means. And there's another part to this, if you just give me one moment. I think we're, listening to you talk about the early Cold War years and the end of the 20th century. It's so different now. We're not going back to a détente era. Whatever we do in NATO, much of what we are doing is not the future of the world. So I think when we do a lot of navel gazing around what's going to happen with NATO, we're missing some bigger conversations that actually have an impact on NATO. For example, the coming power of the global south. It's more immediate for Europe than it is for the U.S. But if you look at Russia and China, like we're still focusing on great power competition in some traditional way. But there's no competition for the West from Russia and China if we have certain types of partnerships. They won't be new NATO ones, but with those key players in the emerging global South. Russia and China actually have those relationships. We have very few. They have the BRICS Plus movement, which many have said it can't go very far, but you've now got like 25 nations in principle wanting to de-dollarize the world with an express goal of toppling the liberal international order. We don't have an equivalent. They've got the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. You can say that's not a NATO or the EU, but it picks up the India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Irans of the world. What are we doing to prepare for where the population is going to be? And by 2030, a fourth of the youth population in the world will be on the African continent and will only grow from there. And then we have Latin America, which we rarely talk about. So I'm looking at this in a very different way, not just the traditional alliance discussion, which excludes the rest of the world.
Well, we'll get back to the Global South briefly, but I did want to ask, since you brought up the bridge, I'd love to hear your insights on whether you think that this bridge to Ukrainian membership for NATO is a viable option or not. And I mean, from a European perspective, where things stand on Ukrainian NATO membership.
Joe Biden said repeatedly that there would be no NATOization of Ukraine. So, I mentioned transparency and clarity earlier in the conversation. If the current US president, who's a Democrat, doesn't want to see this happening, and he doesn't want to see this happening at the Washington NATO summit, but my sense is he doesn't want to see this happening ever. And this is not coming from a Republican. So if the US, which is the biggest stakeholder inside the alliance, doesn't want to see this happening, and my sense is Donald Trump, who doesn't really believe in NATO or alliances, would clearly not try to expand NATO, particularly to Ukraine, then we're looking at a situation where we have an opposition from the US on this issue. I think a number of European countries do want it because they realize that Vladimir Putin really is after Ukraine. After the expansion of NATO to Sweden and Finland, he actually removed troops from the Oblast of Kaliningrad. So this was not about NATO expansion per se, but it is definitely about Ukraine getting into the Euro-Atlantic space. And this is something that he'll want to prevent, something that President Joe Biden is very wary and conscious of, and he said it repeatedly now. So I think as long as the US is clear that it's not going to happen, Europeans may continue to push. But I think for now, the answer from Washington is no. So let's see what the bridge is, what it means concretely. One of the things that Secretary of State Antony Blinken said at Brookings last week was that there was a real willingness from the US side to rebuild Ukraine's economy, to welcome it into the concert of democracies and to really make it a core European country, successful European country. So I think if it leads to that, that's already very positive. But I think, and maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think we'll see a NATOization of Ukraine right now, as long as the US is against it. That's just where the end of the line is.
Sam, a common refrain you hear from senior officials in countries on the eastern flank, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, is if Putin's successful in Ukraine, we will be next, that he would cross the threshold and attack NATO's eastern flank. What do you make of that argument? Is that accurate?
Well, I think, predicting Putin's future moves is probably a fool's errand, given that he's certainly done some things that have surprised us in the last 2.5 years. I would say, though, that the premise of the assertion, right, that if he wins in Ukraine, I'm not quite sure what that means. Does that mean a full occupation of the entire country, that he imposes his desired political objectives? I think, the lack of specificity there is kind of telling. I don't think Russia's in a position to, occupy Kharkiv, let alone to take the entire country and move on to attacking NATO allies. I think The key question also is about Russian drivers of Russian behavior, right? I mean, does the fact of alliance membership affect Russian decision-making when it comes to attacking a country or not? And I think we've seen that it does, particularly during this war when arguably Russia has had more incentive to attack NATO allies through which, key supply lines of weapons that are, killing Russian soldiers on an industrial scale are passing, and it is not doing so quite deliberately, right? So I think we've seen that the alliance deterrent is actually quite effective during this war. I would, I guess, respond to that by asking for clarification about what that statement actually means in practical terms.
Kyron, you brought up the global south, this catch-all term for the non-Western countries here. Everyone at these NATO summits says, oh, we need to engage the global south. What would the metrics for success be on that at the Washington summit? What would you like to see for NATO to address this reality you're talking about of the rise of middle powers, of Russia and China competing in places like Africa and Latin America? Is it just a couple lines in a NATO communique? Is it a couple speeches to start stuff out? I mean, where does NATO start on this debate?
I think it's more fundamental than a statement in the communique. When you think about it, a big contribution where, in terms of Washington leadership in the 21st century has been to develop something of a coherent and identifiable Indo-Pacific strategy. But I think we actually put too much pressure on NATO in the sense of developing an Atlantic strategy, which we actually don't have. And the Atlantic strategy idea is one that some colleagues and I at Heritage Foundation have talked about and written a little bit about. The notion that you could kind of knit together the littoral nations of Europe, the African continent, and the Western Hemisphere, and then others that may be landlocked but join in common purpose is something I think that is deeply needed. There's actually too much pressure on NATO for the larger Atlantic world and for the transatlantic relationship as well. So I think thinking bigger and developing a strategic doctrine that brings in much of what will be the future, anchored in Western ideas with Europe and North America as the center is really important. It doesn't mean that we jettison NATO, but I think there's too much pressure on one alliance for a bigger purpose, which includes dozens and dozens of nations that will represent the future. So that may seem a little bit high altitude, but I think that's what we need to start. Does that show up in a communique? Not necessarily, but I think that should become a big part of the future. Not that we shrink the importance of NATO, but we right-size it with the other kinds of activities that we'll do in the Atlantic world.
Derek, can you talk a bit about, just as a last word here, the debate about how to engage the Global South from the European perspective? I mean, is there anything going on in European capitals now beyond the, one-dimensional, oh, we need to engage the Global South? Ukraine has shown us we need to, get other countries on our side now. And do you see that coming about at this NATO summit in any meaningful way?
Yeah. We're hearing echoes of your voice, Robbie. One of the things that the EU put forward actually before the beginning of the war in Ukraine is this little thing called the European Green Deal, in which it provides supposedly public and private funds to developing economies to actually transform their industries in as much as a green way as possible to do a clean transition. So this is something, one of the big projects of the EU was called the Global Gateway. And it was supposed to provide funds for the Indo-Pacific, but also to rebuild the EU's relationships with a number of African nations. That was one of the mottos that Ursula von der Leyen, the President Commission, had when coming in 2019. It kind of got taken over, of course, by COVID and by other issues. But this is something that the Europeans care about. I don't think that it's enough, and they have yet to come up with a proper offer for the Global South to explain, I think, where the EU stands and how it can actually build new principles with a much larger portion of the world to make sure that also the balance of power is more balanced. It is true that we're not in a situation where Europe and the US can decide the outcome of the future of the world. I don't think that is feasible anymore. We've been talking about middle powers, hedging powers. I take a bit of an issue with that because I think France and the US and other countries are hedging powers too. That's fine. And we're hedging in the direction that we want to go in, but we just cannot ignore the vast majority of the world anymore as we did until now. And I hope that that's going to be for the better too.
Excellent. Well, I have a million more questions, but that is our time. So thank you so much. I'd love to